It has to be one of the most pivotal elections in U.S. history as Americans go to the polls on November 3rd. What will be the impact on Canada U.S. relations? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. The countdown is on to determining the next president of the United States. While Joe Biden has been flirting with an 8 to 10 point lead, as 2016 showed us, anything can happen. Donald Trump's unpredictability and protectionist bents have rubbed many leaders the wrong way, the U.S. being Canada's largest trading partner. Canada has also felt that wrath several times over the last 4 years. We have enjoyed the longest undefended border in the world, but that's been shuttered since March due to the COVID pandemic. Coming up on the Unpublished Cafe, we'll take a look at what's on the line for Canada-U.S. relations ahead of the vote. Mark High is the president of the Canada-U.S. Business Association, and he joins us now. And Mark, let's just describe for the listeners your members. Where is your association pretty well based out of, and what do you cover?
Well, hi, Ed. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate the chance to share our little story with you. Yeah, the Canada-U.S. Business Association, we're based in the Detroit, Windsor, Southeast Michigan, Southwest Ontario area. Really cover from Grand Rapids, Michigan, up to London, Ontario, I'd like to say, and beyond. A lot of small, medium-sized businesses are participants with us. Certainly professional firms, but also companies like FCA Canada, Magna, and groups like that work really closely with the Windsor Essex Chamber and the Detroit Regional Chamber.
And I think for a lot of people, the Detroit-Windsor corridor is like the biggest transportation hub, or at least in terms of trade hub, in North America, is it not?
Yeah, that's true. Everybody probably knows the numbers, sort of $700 billion in goods and services across our borders every year, and about a quarter of that goes right through Detroit, Windsor, certainly when you include Port Huron, Sarnia.
Mm-hmm. Now, for your association and your members, what kind of growth have they seen over the last 4 years between 2016 and 2020 prior to the pandemic?
Yeah, well, it certainly has been a continuation of the growth from the last recession, I guess, 08, 09. Very strong, and certainly in Detroit itself. I mean, we know what the autos have done in the last half dozen years, but certainly in Detroit, we've had a great renaissance. So we like to call ourselves the Renaissance City of people moving downtown, restaurants opening, some retail, just continued growth in the 3 or 4 county region here. It was a good run.
What was driving that growth?
Well, I think a lot of young kids like to be in the big city, and so including my oldest daughter has moved into Detroit. So it's just great fun to see all the arts and culture developing down there.
Mark High is joining us in the Unpublished Cafe. He's president of the Canada-U.S. Business Association as we discuss the Canada-U.S. relationship just ahead of the U.S. election coming up on November 3rd. And we talked about your members, and we've seen growth over the last 4 years prior to the pandemic. What's the impact of the pandemic been on them since March?
Well, I think like a lot of cities, I mean, across both countries, it's gotten very quiet downtown. Some groups are doing very well, like at my law firm, Dickinson Wright. I'm in the Detroit office. Some groups are doing very well. The employment people have been very busy during this whole time. The M&A folks, it's been a little quieter for the last several months, although even that's picking up.
And of course, you know, the key to this is the border. And while it appears Americans would like to see it reopen, Canadians, for the most part, do not. How do you convince Canadians it's the right thing to open up the border with the U.S.?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think here, I mean, Windsor and Detroit, if I was in my office, I'd be looking out the window, and less than a mile away across the Detroit River is Windsor. So we're very closely tied together. 3,000, 4,000 medical personnel come over from Windsor every day. We have buses and taxis running between the two cities in a normal time. So I think Windsor understands that the two cities are two countries are tied together very well. And I think Canada as a whole understands that as well. Isn't something like 80% of the country live within 100 miles of the border. But they do have concerns that are probably legitimate ones. And we have to find a way to allow people to go back and forth in a way that does provide comfort to both countries, that there isn't a problem.
And there's a bit...
when you think about it, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, you go ahead, and I'll finish up.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, there's been a lot of transit across the borders without any problems. The trucking has continued this whole time. Food, ag, manufacturing. The truck traffic at the Ambassador Bridge has not really dropped much in the last 6 months. Plus those professionals going back and forth, and I know some business people that are able to go back and forth, and there hasn't been a problem from that. So I think we may be looking at a simplistic solution to a problem that may not really exist.
And we wanted to talk about this pilot project for international travelers. Your association is very interested in that. Well, it's not just international travelers. There's a couple of border crossings as well that are going to be sampled, right?
Yeah, that's right. Just in the last week to Alberta, I think that's worked out a pilot program with the Canadian federal government to do testing at the airports and at least one land crossing up there. Where they're do testing, and then that can mitigate having to do the 2-week quarantine, the 14-day quarantine that would otherwise apply. And that's a great, there are several of us on both sides of the border that are working at trying to come up with a plan. That's a great first step to use the technology rather than sort of a blunt force 14-day quarantine where it doesn't really may not be necessary.
Yeah, it seems in a lot of situations, depending on which government's in charge, a lot of them are using a hammer to kill a fly here, and I guess the impact is economic, is devastating. Yeah,
well, it's a big fly, but nonetheless, the hammer is probably an overkill device. So, we'd like to think, and part of it is the testing has developed over the last several months, and it costs money to do that sort of thing. You got to come up with budget to address it, but the effects are so severe that there's got to be a better way than just closing everything down.
And considering the two candidates for the election, I'm guessing the association doesn't have a preference. You'll work with everybody or anybody?
Well, we certainly will work with everybody and anybody, but some people may be easier to work with than others. We like the ability to be able to understand what is going on and have some confidence as to what will happen, next week, next month, tomorrow. It's a little unclear, and it's hard to make plans if you don't know what's going to happen, around the corner.
Yeah, that's the issue. When everything's up in the air, if nothing feels, you have no stability, but to base yourself on.
That's right. We are looking forward to seeing what happens next week. It's very close at hand at this point. Everybody is waiting with bated breath.
Exactly. Mark, I want to thank you for joining us.
Appreciate the chance, Ed. Love to stay in touch.
Mark High is the president of the Canada-U.S. Business Association. As mentioned, the overwhelming majority of Canadians would support a Joe Biden presidency. Polling also shows Donald Trump has one of the lowest approval ratings as a leader. Frank Graves is the president of Ecos Research, and he joins us now. And Frank, how engaged are Canadians in this U.S. election?
They're deeply engaged. They're probably paying much more attention to the U.S. election right now than they are to their own political scene. And I don't know how it would compare through time, but I'm guessing they're probably that the levels of engagement and attention to the U.S. election are probably at an all-time high in Canada. And that may be the case in the United States as well, if we were to judge from the incredible turnout, which has already been registered in the United States.
What does this election mean for the United States?
Well, I think it's a historic election, and certainly that's the view of Canadians. I've asked them this question in polling. I've asked them, do you think that the United States is on the verge of chaos? And 80% of Canadians agree. Almost three-quarters of Canadians think that for the United States to pull out of what they see as death spiral might be a bit of a hyperbole, but certainly a really incredible erosion of performance in the face of the pandemic. They think there has to be a regime change and for the United States to have a chance at recovering. So, yeah, the stakes are huge, and they're not just huge for the United States. Canada's not voting in this, but obviously this is our critical economic partner, our political ally, our strategic ally. So I know that Canadian outlook on the United States is at an all-time low. That we've had periods, and I've been tracking it for many decades, where Canadians have been alarmed at where the United States is going. I didn't poll back then, but I'm sure we would go back to things like the Vietnam War, but more specifically, Bush and the Iraq War. There was real concerns in Canada about whether that was in the right direction. But the numbers we're seeing today in terms of the rating of the U.S.-Canada relationship, it's at a historical nadir. The trust or confidence or approval in the current incumbent, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is at a level that we've never seen. He's registering an approval rating in Canada of about 15%. This is not uncommon. Pew polls on these questions around the world, and they're consistently finding the approval rating for the current President of the United States the lowest in their tracking as well. But just to put that in context, that 15% when Obama left office, his approval rating was about 75%. So it's, and we've never seen an approval rating, even in the darkest period where people were really annoyed, angry with George Bush's approval rating in Canada was never dropped below 30%. So yeah, there's deep concerns. The Canadians overwhelmingly think that the United States has made the pandemic a much worse problem, not just for the United States, but for Canada. They feel that as well about China. So yeah, they're on the edge of their seats, kind of wondering what's going to happen in, I guess, 5 days now.
How would you characterize Canada-U.S. relations right now?
Well, from a public perspective, the Canadians rate the relationship with the United States as the worst that we've ever seen. The incidents that people say they would like to become more like the United States or less like the United States, the highest numbers ever, those saying we'd like to become less like the United States. Now, that's quite different from, the world of democracy and relations at the government level. I suspect that's all largely on hold right now, with a few exceptions. I think there was announcements on aluminum, and we were exempted, but basically everything's on hold pending the election. And I would say the relationship between the governments at the officials level, wasn't great, but it wasn't nearly as bad as the sort of the public perception of the relationship, which is frankly awful.
Frank Graves joining us in the Unpublished Cafe. He's the president of Ecos Research as we talk about the Canada-U.S. relationship just ahead of the 2020 U.S. election. And we talk about the U.S., our biggest trading partner. Yet when things go south, you have, Canada has pretty well all its eggs in one basket, the American basket. Is this a sign where Canada needs to diversify more?
Well, certainly Canadians are telling us that.
Mhm.
And interestingly, they're telling us that at the same time that the other prime candidate for diversification, which was China, is really falling off the radar as a preferred trading partner for Canada for a variety of reasons. Some of them related to the pandemic, some of them related to the two Michaels. But yeah, so we've got this situation where Canadians are feeling very, very wary of the two largest economies and principal potential trading partners. The relationship with the United States will recover. I mean, geography, history, economics, politics mean that this will recover. The other thing that we've seen, though, which is notable, interestingly, Canadians want to strengthen relationships with Europe right now in terms of trading. But there has been some diminution of Canadians' appetite for globalization in general, but trade liberalization in particular. This pandemic has laid bare the fragility of global supply chains as it applied certainly to things like health PPE and vaccines, but it's also spilled over into a desire to recreate a made-in-Canada manufacturing capacity. And you may see that, which when we compare, and I've asked polling questions on this that have been asked in Europe and the United States, Canadians are really strongly committed, more so than those countries, to rebuilding our manufacturing capacity, partly as a response to not being vulnerable to the kind of fragility of the global supply chains that they've seen before. And it's also just a bit of an inward movement. Canadians feeling a little more insular, a little more in favor of thicker borders, a little less likely to say want to go outside of the country, have people come here. Is that an ephemeral response, or will Canadians return to being a very open society? I think they'll return to being an open society, but the impacts so far have been dramatic.
Now, one of the, I guess, the wild cards in this whole thing leading up to November 3rd is concern about a possible transition of power. We've heard that it might not exactly be smooth. Does that concern you or Canadians?
No, Canadians are, and I have tested on this, Canadians are worried that the United States is on the brink of potential civil unrest and violence, maybe even a civil war. Not a civil war like in Spain or in the United States in the 1860s, but maybe something more like the kind of troubles that Ireland experienced for so long. That you've got armed militia showing up at state legislatures, plots to kill leaders. This is an unprecedented period, and the division and polarization that we see in the United States, and we've measured it. I polled in the United States recently, and this rising authoritarian populism, which has gripped a significant part of the American public, it's not a healthy force. There's various forms of populism which work out okay. Things like, for example, the New Deal and FDR's was a populist vision which ushered in the rise of the middle class. But most of this type of authoritarian populism ends up either deeply disappointing or in a disaster, as it did in Europe with the rise of fascism and Nazism. And I'm not predicting anything that ominous, but this force is a largely misunderstood and dangerous force, and it's definitely at play. It's at play in Canada, by the way. We think that we're somehow immune or we've inoculated, none of this happens. I've been doing research showing that a lot of this force is present in Canada, and it's produced a rapid polarization and sorting of the Canadian electorate in ways that doesn't resemble what it looked like a decade ago. And most Canadians are largely oblivious to this. I was just reading an international study done by some Swedish scholars yesterday that showed that Canada, along with the United States, had in fact experienced the most intense polarization over the last 30 years, and it was continuing. They were measuring this by looking at what they called affective engagement, which is whether you thought the other party, whether you saw them emotionally as in really negative terms or not. In both countries, there is this real hostility and animus towards the other party, which was not the case not that long ago.
Frank, I want to thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Frank Graves is the president of Ecos Research. Those who don't recall history are doomed to repeat it, according to the old saying, and to realize where we are in Canada-U.S. relations We need to look back. Christopher Sands is a senior research professor and the director of the Center for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And Chris, how would you describe the last 4 years of Canada-U.S. relations?
Well, it's funny. I think it's a bit of a split personality. On the one hand, the day-to-day relationship between the government departments and officials and so on has actually been really good. I think all the people who work so hard to, whether it's manage the border or help coordinate economic policy, have been doing pretty well. But the headliner, the politicians, the top end of the relationship has really been shaken by, frankly, the unpredictability and unconventionality of U.S. President Donald Trump. He isn't a standard issue U.S. president. I think even his supporters would agree with that assessment. And so that's meant that for Canadians, you just never know what you're going to get from Washington, D.C. these days.
That's for sure. That's for sure. Now, when we talk about those political leaders and the relationship between the two countries, has it ever been worse than it has been in the last 4 years?
Not on a sustained basis. So, Canadians will remember the harsh words between Richard Nixon and Pierre Trudeau. They'll remember Lester Pearson and Lyndon Johnson having a dust up where Johnson reportedly picked up Lester Pearson by his lapels. So we've definitely had those moments, and we've had some smaller problems where, for example, when Canada decided under Jean Chrétien not to participate in the Iraq War, there was some frosty feelings in Washington because he chose to string out the talks and then say, well, as a matter of principle, he could never say yes, which seemed to waste a lot of time for the Americans. So there have been moments like that where things have been bad, but they're much more episodic. Usually it's a bad meeting, it's a bad moment, maybe even a bad month or two, and then we get back to business. Really, I think the relationship was always a little bit shaken up, particularly, though, after Canada hosted the G7 in Charlevoix, Quebec, and following that meeting, President Trump said that he thought that Justin Trudeau was weak and a backstabber, and from that moment on, the personal relationship between them, they still have had calls, they've still dealt with each other, but the personal relationship has been quite frosty.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot about that. Canada appears to be caught in the dispute between the U.S. and China over the Meng Wanzhou Huawei issue. Would it get better under a potential Biden administration?
No, I don't think the China situation will get better. I've been really surprised that Republicans and Democrats on the Hill and around Washington have really hardened their line on China. There had long been a feeling going back to the Clinton administration supporting China's peaceful rise and integration into the international community. But these days, whether it's theft of intellectual property, the way that they've handled Belt and Road, the South China Sea aggression, there seems to be a very strong feeling that China needs to be confronted by the United States in both parties. And I think the particular challenge for a Biden administration, if former Vice President Biden wins next week, the problem for him is that he has been involved with China relations, suggesting that the Chinese are nice people and so on. And as his son's business dealings get more attention, I think it will be hard for Joe Biden to be as friendly to China as he might like to be, because the accusation will be he's going soft on China because of past payments or corruption. And so in order to kind of escape that, I think he has to be tough on China, perhaps not as tough as Donald Trump, but I think he'll sustain that policy, unfortunately, because I think it puts Canada in a very tricky position.
Very much so. Let's talk about energy policy. Now, Trump, we know, is good for oil, and Biden's talking about clean energy. So from the Canadian perspective, which way would you want to side?
Well, it's interesting, and I happen to feel that Joe Biden is actually your best bet in Canada because he's a bit of a double win. First of all, he has been very critical of hydrofracturing, which has been responsible for this huge boom in U.S. oil and gas production. And if he does put restraints on it, even just restraining activity on federal land, that will lower U.S. oil and gas production, which will open up space for the country that has long been our number one foreign supplier of energy in all forms, but particularly oil and gas, and that's Canada. So you get a win there. At the same time, Joe Biden is a very centrist Democrat, and although he has signed on to a lot of the rhetoric of the Green New Deal that's been proposed by progressive members of his party, there's also an element in his traditional approach which favors alternatives. And I think there are two that Canada stands to benefit from. One is a recognition of hydropower as renewable. This is something not all environmentalists agree with, but it's a sensible centrist course, and that could open up the path to more imports from Canada, not just from Hydro-Quebec, but from places like Manitoba or British Columbia, if we can sign a Columbia River Treaty. The other is small modular nuclear reactors. The technology's moved very far forward now. And if you look at the U.S. Midwest, it's probably the most energy-starved energy market. I mean, they really need a lot of energy to run manufacturing plants in the Midwest. And yet, typically, they just don't have a lot of local supplies. So nuclear has long been very popular in the Midwest, in places like Ohio and Michigan and Illinois, where we have a number of facilities. I think there's a real opportunity there, and Atomic Energy of Canada Limited is a leading purveyor for Canada to also sell nuclear. And of course, that has a knock-on benefit for uranium mining, including in Saskatchewan and other parts of Canada. So I think on an energy front, Joe Biden is pretty much the best opportunity you get. But even if Trump is reelected, that's not all bad news. Trump's been much more supportive of completing the Keystone Pipeline. And also, we've seen a lot of progress on TMX, plus Enbridge's Line 3 and Line 5. Early in the next administration, the potential for Canada not only to have more secure, stable access to the U.S. market, but also access to the sea through which they can reach a number of countries, I think is a big positive. The arguments that some environmentalists have made is we don't want to perpetuate the fossil fuel economy, and that's fair. But where Canada could be incredibly important is as a bridge for countries like China, but all over the developing world that are more coal dependent or using other less savory kinds of energy. Oil is especially low carbon intensity oil, which is what Alberta is trying to shift the oil sands to, would be very good for those countries until they are wealthy enough to actually begin looking at some of the new alternatives like wind power and certainly nuclear. So I think there's a very good story for Canada's energy, and I know that's something that people in the energy sector will want to hear, because we've had some really bad years lately for everyone involved, and a lot of unemployment in that sector. So it might be good news whoever wins.
COVID-19, the U.S. is over 225,000 deaths. From your perspective, will the handling of the pandemic be the key issue of this election?
I think it's hard to say. It's certainly one thing that we're all talking about, and it's an issue that has really split people in the sense that what I do, teaching, I can do online. The students don't like the online classes as much as they like seeing me, because I'm funny and I usually bring cookies to class. But on the other hand, a lot of ordinary Americans who work in jobs you can't telework for. I think about my car mechanic, or sometimes I think about people who do medical jobs, obviously on the front lines here. They just can't telework. And in many of those sectors, they've been out of work and out of income. Like Canada, the U.S. has provided some funds for those individuals to help them get through this, but it's not been an easy time. The question is, who do they blame? Do people who've found this to be a really tough time look at President Trump and say, you're the one who did this to me, or, so we got to get rid of you? Or do they look at him and say, this is a global mess? There aren't very many countries that really have a perfect record. People talk about Sweden, even Canada doing well, but there's still been problems everywhere. And so if they look at this as just sort of a natural disaster and see Trump as having done his best, that might be enough to save him. I'd add one other thing. Like Canada, the U.S. has had a federalism sort of response, in the sense that it's been U.S. states that do most of the local public health work, including getting people tested and getting them hopefully vaccine shots down the road. It's also U.S. states that made the decisions on closing the economy down. And states like Wyoming have been willing to open up more because they haven't had much incidence, and they're pretty remote states without a lot of density. a solution that wouldn't work in a New York or a California. And so that variety means that different people are experiencing the pandemic in different ways. And I think when Canadians look down, they see the bad news. Bad news travels better than the good news. But there are parts of the country, and a lot of it is Trump country, where people are much happier with where they are right now, and they're having a better experience. And so that's key, because coming up, they're doing better financially, and their economy getting back on track will help get Canadian exports to the U.S. back on track. And that's something that we'll both need as we try to get the economy going again.
One of the comments that came out the last week, coming from Donald Trump, if he did lose the election, was a possible, not a peaceful transition of power. And does that concern you?
It does and it doesn't. Ever since the 2000 election was sort of the famous Bush v. Gore election that went all the way up to the Supreme Court over the hanging chads in Florida, it's become standard practice that every presidential campaign has a platoon of lawyers ready to challenge election results or any irregularities. And because the U.S. administers elections in a decentralized fashion, they have to have that platoon of lawyers in every one of the 50 states and all of the territories in order to challenge results. So that's now become standard practice. Not only that, many people criticized Al Gore for conceding too early in 2000. They also criticized Mitt Romney when he conceded early in 2012, and Hillary Clinton when she conceded in the 2016 election. So now it's almost the expectation there'll be a challenge, and I know we're going to have a lot of lawyers having a field day and lots of billable hours. But I think that the dust will settle fairly quickly if we have a clear winner, hopefully clear enough there, and we will inaugurate someone on the 20th of January. That's an inflexible date in the U.S. Constitution, so we have to do that. Now, then the question is, do we trust that Donald Trump will go peacefully if he loses? And my view is he will, but not necessarily in a way that's good news for Joe Biden. I don't think he's going to try to have a coup or force the military to drag him out of the White House. I think that's sort of a cable TV fantasy, soon to be a Hallmark classic movie. But I think Donald Trump, if he does not win, will retain a very strong following in the United States. And because he believes that Democrats tried to sandbag his administration from the beginning with what he views to be rather exaggerated, phony conspiracy theories, the Russian involvement, the Ukraine involvement, various things, I think he will. I think he'll look for revenge. And what I mean by that is on Twitter, on social media, on TV, on radio, possibly with his own TV station, constantly hammering the Democrats and the Biden administration, exploiting differences between a more centrist Joe Biden and a more progressive wing of the party that has been pushing for much more radical change, including things like the Green New Deal. And he'll try to make Washington as ungovernable for Biden as it was for him. Now, for better or for worse, Donald Trump survived all of that interference in the administration and was able to actually achieve some things. Joe Biden, not only because he's older, but also because he isn't really at the center of his own political party, and because no one expects him to run for re-election, I think we'll have a hard time coping with disruption from Donald Trump. So while I think that he will leave office if he does lose, I think that he will be with us for some time, and not necessarily in a way that's very good for getting things done in Washington.
Do you have a prediction on the outcome on November 3rd?
Oh, well, yeah, that my prediction, and I think $3 will get you coffee at Starbucks. It's really not worth very much. But if I were putting money down, I actually think that Donald Trump will get reelected. And I don't say that enthusiastically, but all of the last four presidents who've gone for reelection have won it. The last person who lost was George H.W. Bush. And in George H.W. Bush's case, he really represented continuity with 8 years of Ronald Reagan, so that there was a feeling that after 12 years, the Republicans had their chance. Since then, we've just alternated parties, Republicans, Democrats, and this would be early. Now, in so many ways, Donald Trump's an extraordinary president, so maybe we can't look to precedent and really have a good judgment. But I think that he has done a better job of firing up his base. He's been a very aggressive campaigner. The media don't like him, but that's one of the reasons that a lot of voters who don't trust the media do like him. So I think his unconventional style and the energy that he's brought to his campaigning in contrast with Joe Biden, who I think doesn't fire up his base very much, and who spent so much of this campaign not going out, not meeting people, not doing door knocking. It's just the old-fashioned sort of rules of politics. Biden, I think, is at a disadvantage. But as I said before, this is the first time we've had an election in the middle of a COVID crisis. This is the first time we've tried anything like this. So I don't know. Precedent might not be worth much. We'll have to wait and see.
Chris, I want to thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Ed, and look forward to listening to the podcast when it's up.
Christopher Sands is the senior research professor and the director of the Center for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And that leads to our unpublished .vote question. Which U.S. presidential candidate do you feel will improve Canada-U.S. relations? Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or unsure? You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote and have your voice heard. I want to thank Mark High, president of the Canada-U.S. Business Association, Frank Graves, president of Ecos Research, and Christopher Sands, senior research professor and the director at the Center for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And I want to thank you for listening to the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.